They thought she was nobody, just a tired server in a roadside bar. But when a ruthless gang tried to break her, they uncovered something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Naomi Carter, a quiet black woman they believed was powerless, carried a past written in scars and strength. That night, the predator became the prey, and the bar became the stage for a revelation no one would forget. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never look at an ordinary person the same way again. The glass shattered before anyone had the chance to breathe. A heavy beer mug exploded against the hardwood floor of Carter's Roadhouse, its echo rolling through the room like a gunshot. The jukebox fell silent. Conversations froze. And for a moment, the only sound was the slow drip of foam sliding across the floorboards. People turned their eyes snapping to the tall white man standing in the center of the bar. His fists clenched, his jaw set, with that particular brand of arrogance that comes when a man thinks the whole room belongs to him. At the far end of the room, Naomi Carter kept her head down, her dark hands moving over the surface of the counter with mechanical precision. She didn't flinch at the sound. She had lived too long in a world where crashes and explosions were part of the background noise. Still, she felt every eye flick toward her. The only black woman in the room, the only server working that night, the only person people seemed to expect would clean up what had just broken. She reached for the broom without looking up, her long braids falling over her cheek as she bent to sweep the fragments into a neat pile. For most people in this corner of Georgia, Naomi was invisible. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, but in a town where a woman with skin the color of polished walnut was seen first through the filter of stereotype invisibility was its own kind of armor. Patrons called her girl. Instead of her name, tipped less than they tipped. The younger white servers assumed she was just another single mother trying to get by. She let them think what they wanted. The less they saw, the safer she was. Or so she believed. That night, however, safety was a luxury no one in Carter's Roadhouse could afford. They had rolled in around 8, their Harley engines shattering the still summer air, like thunder rolling down Peachtree Street. 10 of them, leather vests, gleaming steel chains, jangling eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, even after sundown. The Steel Serpents Motorcycle Club. Their reputation had arrived in Atlanta long before they did 3 bars in as many weeks, burned to the ground, each owner warned beforehand, and foolish enough to think the threat was a bluff. One owner was still in the hospital, ribs shattered, insisting to the sheriff it had been an accident. Nobody believed him. Everyone knew what the Steel Serpents were capable of. Naomi knew too. She had known the moment she heard the Harleys outside her hand, pausing mid-fold as she stacked napkins into perfect triangles. She didn't rush, didn't panic. Her movements were calm, deliberate, each one economical. She had lived too many years in places where one wrong motion could get you killed. The habits never left you, no matter how far you ran. Rex Donovan, the man everyone called Rex Viper, entered first. 6 foot 3 shoulders, like a wall, a snake tattoo, winding from his jawline into the leather vest that marked him as their king. His boots struck the floor with deliberate weight, a conqueror surveying his new kingdom. Behind him, his men fanned out with the unconscious precision of predators, covering exits, blocking sight lines surrounding the room in a silent chokehold. To anyone else, it looked like swagger. To Naomi, it looked like a tactical maneuver. She noticed the limp in one man's gait, the way another held his beer with his left hand to cover the tremor in his right. She cataloged weaknesses, the way other women noticed hairstyles. She kept wiping down the bar as Rex's shadow fell over her. "Evening, sweetheart." He said, his breath thick with whiskey. His words carried the drawl of someone who had learned long ago how to make menace sound casual. "We're here to have a friendly little talk with the owner." "Where's Murphy out of town?" Naomi murmured, not lifting her eyes. Her voice was soft, unthreatening. "I'm just covering shifts." "Well, ain't that convenient?" Rex leaned closer, the snake tattoo seeming to writhe in the amber light. "Then you'll just have to deliver a message for us. Tell Murphy the steel serpents are offering protection. $5,000 a month, and nothing bad happens here. Understand?" The regulars had gone quiet, shifting in their seats. Some were construction workers with hands calloused from years of hard labor. Others veterans from the nearby base who had seen combat but preferred their memories locked away. Sheriff Bill Hawkins sat in the corner booth, his cup of coffee halfway to his lips, his weathered face unreadable. He wasn't on duty, not tonight, but his presence was a reminder that law and order still had a place in this town, at least in theory. Naomi kept her hands steady as she finished wiping the bar. "I'll let him know you stopped by," she said. Rex's smile slipped. He wasn't used to being dismissed so quietly. His men chuckled a low growl of anticipation. One of them, thin and wiry with yellowed teeth, slapped Naomi on the backside as she passed with a tray. "How about you bring us some smiles with those drinks, girl?" he sneered. She stepped out of reach, in a motion that looked accidental, but wasn't. Her face remained serene, her eyes lowered. To the men watching, she looked like every other black woman who had learned to survive by swallowing anger and bowing her head. To Sheriff Hawkins, who had seen enough combat to recognize poise under pressure, she looked like something else entirely. Something he couldn't quite place yet. The serpents ordered pitchers of beer, their laughter filling the room again. But under it, all the tension was a live wire waiting for a spark. Naomi delivered their drinks without expression, her posture one of perfect submission. But in her pocket, her fingers brushed against the cool metal of a worn dog tag, hidden beneath the loose fabric of her server's shirt. A reminder of another life. A reminder of the warrior she had buried beneath layers of silence and anonymity. And as Rex Donovan leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough for only her to hear, she felt the storm building. 5,000, sweetheart. And if Murphy's too dumb to pay, then this whole place burns. The broom was still in her hand, the broken glass swept into a neat pile. She didn't look up. She didn't answer. But in the quiet set of her jaw, in the way her shoulders squared ever so slightly, there was a promise, the calm before a storm, no one in that bar could have predicted. The night air inside Carter's Roadhouse grew heavier with every passing minute, like a storm pressing down on the walls. Conversations that had once carried the warmth of a summer Friday were reduced to whispers, each patron waiting for someone else to intervene, but no one daring to be the first. The steel serpents had claimed the room, and their leader, Rex Donovan, was not a man accustomed to being told no. He leaned back in his chair, boots on the table, sipping beer with exaggerated ease. His men sprawled around the bar, laughing too loudly, their presence a cage around the room. Naomi Carter moved silently among them, tray balanced on one hand, eyes lowered. She could feel their stares on her skin, not just the weight of male hunger, but something sharper, something crueler, the way some men looked at her, not as a woman, but as a black woman. It was a gaze that carried history, that dripped with entitlement and degradation, and she had learned long ago how to shield herself from it. But shielding only worked when the other side allowed it. Tonight, they would not. The moment came without warning. Rex caught her by the wrist as she set down a pitcher, his grip crushing, pulling her closer. "You listening to me, sweetheart?" He growled, his voice just loud enough to carry across the room. "I don't think you understand how this works. When I say this, place pays, it pays. When I say jump, you ask how high. And when I talk to you, you look me in the eye." His breath reeked of whiskey, his snake tattoo pulsing in the dim light as if alive. Naomi remained still, her gaze fixed on the scarred wood of the table, her expression unreadable. "Let go of me," she said softly, her voice carrying no tremor. The calmness of it made Rex laugh, but it was a humorless sound sharp as a blade. "Oh, you've got a little backbone, huh? Maybe I need to teach you your place." He yanked her closer hard enough that the fabric of her server's shirt tore with a harsh rip that seemed to echo in the silence. The bar collectively inhaled. The white cotton hung in tatters, and beneath it the truth revealed itself like a thunderclap. Black ink stretched across Naomi Carter's shoulders, an eagle with its wings unfurled talons gripping the globe and anchor of the United States Army. Beneath it, in bold, uncompromising letters, 75th Ranger Regiment. To those who understood, it was not just ink. It was a declaration, a lineage, a mark that set her apart as one of the few, the elite the warriors trained to go where others would not. Scars told the rest of the story, puckered flesh at her ribs. The pale line of a knife wound across her shoulder, faint shrapnel patterns disappearing beneath the edge of her tank top. They were not the scars of accidents. They were the map of a life lived on the edge of death, the souvenirs of war. The room froze. Conversations died mid-breath. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. For a moment, even Rex Donovan seemed robbed of language, his hands still gripping the torn fabric, his eyes struggling to make sense of what he had uncovered. His men shifted uneasily, bravado, slipping from their faces like masks too heavy to hold. Sheriff Bill Hawkins, who had been watching from the corner, set down his cup of coffee with deliberate slowness, his weathered face tightening as recognition dawned. He had seen soldiers like her before, though rarely in civilian clothes and never in a roadside bar wiping tables. "Ranger," someone whispered from the back. A veteran, his voice carrying both awe and disbelief. "She's a goddamn ranger." Naomi's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, but the change was electric. Her shoulders squared her chin, lifted, and the quiet deference that had cloaked her for months fell away like the torn fabric at her feet. She hadn't moved to fight, hadn't raised her voice, but the air around her changed, charged with the weight of someone who had stood in the fire and survived. For years, she had hidden that part of herself, burying it beneath the routine of serving drinks, folding napkins, smiling politely. But it had always been there waiting, and now exposed. It filled the room like thunder clouds rolling in. Rex finally found his voice, but it had lost its certainty. "What the hell is this?" He stammered, eyes darting from her tattoo to her scars. "Who the hell are you?" Naomi looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze with steady, unblinking eyes. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "Naomi Carter, Sergeant First Class United States Army Rangers. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2 Bronze Stars. Purple Heart." She paused, letting each word land. "And the last person you should have put your hands on tonight." The silence in the room deepened, thick with realization. The serpents glanced at each other, suddenly aware of the dozen veterans scattered among the patrons' men, whose eyes had sharpened, whose postures had straightened at the sight of the tattoo and the scars. They were no longer just barflies. They were soldiers, recognizing one of their own, rallying to an unspoken call. Rex tried to sneer, but the mask was cracking. "So what, you think some ink on your back scares me? You think anyone cares what you used to be?" But the quiver in his voice betrayed him. He was a man who had built his life on intimidation, on the certainty that no one would stand up to him. And now standing before him was someone who had faced worse, much worse, and walked away still breathing. From the corner, Sheriff Hawkins stood. His voice, gravelly and low, carried the authority of decades. "Donovan," he said, using Rex's real name, "I think you just made a mistake you can't afford." The serpents shifted again. Their leader suddenly isolated the weight of the room, turning against him. Naomi hadn't raised a hand, but the power dynamic had shifted entirely. The predator had stumbled into the presence of something he couldn't understand, and now the pack was restless. Naomi bent slowly, picking up the torn remains of her shirt, folding it with the same precision she gave to napkins. The act was quiet, almost tender, but it carried more threat than any raised fist. She looked back at Rex, her voice calm, almost kind. "The difference between you and me is simple. You fight to intimidate. I fought to survive. And I'm still here." The words landed like a hammer. Rex's grip loosened his hand, falling away, his face pale beneath the bravado. Around him, the laughter of his men had died. They could feel it too, that shift in air, that sense that the ground beneath them had tilted. They weren't looking at a waitress anymore. They were looking at someone forged in fire, someone whose quiet presence made their entire act of violence look like a child's game. And in that moment, for the first time since they had roared into Atlanta, the steel serpents looked uncertain. For a long moment, no one moved. Rex Donovan's hand hovered uselessly in the air, where it had once clutched Naomi's torn shirt, his fingers curling and uncurling like he was struggling to remember how to make them obey him. The swagger that had carried him into Carter's Roadhouse was leaking out of him, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar doubt. His crew shifted behind him, muttering under their breath, their earlier confidence cracking like glass under pressure. Naomi Carter didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, her calm presence drawing the oxygen out of the serpent's bravado. She didn't have to puff her chest or raise her voice. The ink on her back, the scars on her skin, the steadiness in her eyes told a story none of them could compete with. She had walked through deserts where the horizon burned with fire, pulled brothers and sisters out of ambushes, while rounds snapped past her ears, buried friends whose names still haunted her dreams. Rex Donovan and his steel serpents were nothing compared to that, and she knew it. "Do you know who you're threatening?" she asked finally, her voice as quiet as falling ash. Her tone wasn't raised, but it cut through the bar with surgical precision. "Do you know what it means to carry this?" She turned slightly, letting the full image of the eagle and anchor catch the amber glow of the lights. The veterans in the room sat straighter. The civilians leaned in, realizing they were witnessing something they would tell stories about for years. Rex tried to laugh, but it was thin brittle. "I don't care who you used to be. This is now, and now this bar belongs to me." Naomi stepped closer, her presence shrinking the space between them until his bulk seemed smaller than it had minutes earlier. She spoke softly, but the softness held steel. "Rex Donovan, dishonorably discharged from the Army for theft of equipment. Founder of the Steel Serpents after you couldn't make it as a soldier. Suspect in 4 arson cases. 2 counts of aggravated assault. 1 woman still limps because of you." The bar murmured. Rex's face drained of color, then flushed red rage and shame warring across his features. "How the hell do you know my name?" He snapped his voice, cracking with the effort to reassert control. Naomi tilted her head, eyes steady. "Because men like you don't scare me. Men like you are the reason people like me had to become who we are. I make it my business to know what threatens the ground I stand on. And tonight, Rex, you threatened the wrong ground." Sheriff Hawkins moved closer now. His stance relaxed, but his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers and seen death. "You should listen to her," he said, his eyes fixed on Rex. "If you've got any sense left, you'll listen." The serpents muttered again, some shifting toward the door, others glancing uneasily at their leader. The balance of power was slipping, and they could feel it. Predators survive on fear. Without it, they are just men with leather jackets and too much to prove. Naomi reached into her apron pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the chain that hung around her neck. A pair of dog tags clinked softly in the still air. She held them between her fingers, the edges worn smooth from years of wear. "You think fear makes you strong. It doesn't. Discipline does. Courage does. Loyalty does. And I carry every ounce of that still." She let the tags fall back against her chest, then stepped closer, her voice dropping to a tone that carried command, not request. "Kneel." The word cracked through the room like a gunshot. For an instant, Rex resisted his jaw, tight, his fists trembling. But Naomi had spoken with the voice of someone who had ordered men into fire and brought them back again. Someone who knew what it meant to hold life and death in a single syllable. That kind of authority wasn't something you could fake, and Rex felt it cut straight through the thin armor of his pride. His knees hit the floor before his mind caught up the sound of it, sharp and final. Gasps rippled through the bar. The serpents froze, watching their leader kneel in front of a woman they had mocked just minutes before. Veterans exchanged looks, silent recognition flashing in their eyes. They had seen men buckle under the weight of command before. They knew what it meant. Naomi looked down at him, her face unreadable. You broke glass in my bar. You laid your hands on me. You threatened this place, these people. You owe me an apology. The words were calm, but they carried a razor edge. Rex swallowed his throat, working as the room's eyes bored into him. I'm sorry. He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Louder, Naomi said. I'm sorry. His voice cracked, rising in pitched desperation bleeding through. Naomi nodded, once satisfied. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply stepped back, granting him the dignity of space, even as he knelt in humiliation. Now you're going to walk out of here, she continued, and you're going to tell every man in your crew and every man in your circle that Carter's Roadhouse is off limits, that this county is under the protection of people who've seen worse than you on our easiest days, and you're never going to come back. Rex's eyes darted toward his men, looking for support, but none met his gaze. Some were already edging toward the door, their loyalty evaporating in the face of his defeat. Slowly, shakily, he pushed himself to his feet, nodding, his face pale. We won't be back, he stammered. I swear it. The room remained silent, watching as the serpents gathered themselves. Their earlier swagger broken their exit, clumsy and hurried. The roar of their motorcycles outside was less triumphant than when they had arrived, more like the retreat of beaten dogs slinking into the night. Naomi stood in the center of the bar, her torn shirt folded neatly in her hand, her breathing steady. Around her, the tension eased, conversations beginning again in hushed tones. The veterans in particular looking at her with a mixture of respect and something deeper, something like kinship. Sheriff Hawkins approached, his expression softer now, though his eyes still carried the weight of what he had witnessed. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice carrying both gratitude and awe. You could have pressed charges. You had every right. Naomi shook her head, her gaze steady on the door where the serpents had vanished. I don't need the law to handle men like that. Sometimes the only justice they understand is to be reminded they're not as powerful as they think they are. The sheriff nodded slowly. Well, you reminded them tonight, and the rest of us too. For Naomi, the moment wasn't about triumph. It wasn't about winning a fight or humiliating Rex Donovan. It was about something quieter, something more essential. For months, she had tried to disappear, to hide her past beneath the routine of bar shifts and folded napkins. But the storm had come to her doorstep, and she had been forced to remember who she was. Standing there, in the silence after the storm, she realized something she had tried to forget. Peace isn't found in hiding. It's created by standing your ground. And as the night stretched on, Carter's Roadhouse no longer felt like just a roadside bar. It felt like something more, something sacred. A place where the tide had turned. The night the steel serpents fled Carter's Roadhouse left behind a silence that felt different from the hush of fear that had blanketed the bar earlier. This silence hummed with something else: relief, disbelief, respect. Patrons lingered in their seats, nursing their drinks, not because they were thirsty, but because they didn't want to be the first to leave. They had witnessed something few people ever would the moment a predator was stripped bare by nothing more than presence, history, and unshakable will. Naomi Carter busied herself with the little things. She cleared broken glass, swept the splinters of her shattered shirt from the floor, and returned tables to order with the same precision she had always carried in her movements. To an outsider, she looked like a woman trying to move on from a disruption, slipping back into her duties as if nothing monumental had occurred. But for those watching, there was no mistaking it. The room had changed because of her, and she could no longer pretend she was invisible. Sheriff Hawkins stayed until the last customer left. He leaned against the bar as Naomi stacked stools for mopping his weathered face softened by something like pride. "You know the word's going to spread," he said quietly. "What happened here tonight, it won't stay between these four walls. By morning, half of Atlanta will know, and by the end of the week, it'll be across the state." Naomi set down the stool in her hands and met his eyes. There was no fear, there only quiet acceptance. "Then let it spread," she said. "I'm tired of hiding." And spread it did. Within days, Carter's Roadhouse transformed. Veterans began arriving in groups, some in old unit jackets, others with tattoos marking tours and campaigns. They came not to drink away ghosts, but to sit in a place where they felt seen. They came to catch a glimpse of the woman whose name was whispered like a legend, the Black Ranger who had stood against a gang and left them crawling. At first, Naomi bristled at the attention. She didn't crave the spotlight. For years, she had tried to fade into civilian life, to bury her identity under the routine of labor and the camouflage of anonymity. But something unexpected began to happen. People didn't come only to gawk. They came to share. Stories spilled across the wooden tables. Stories of Fallujah, Kandahar, Ramadi. Places most civilians couldn't pronounce, but every veteran knew by the taste of dust and fear. And in sharing something loosened in them, the weight of unspoken memories finally allowed air. Naomi listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was with the honesty of someone who had nothing left to prove. She admitted her nightmares, her regrets the nights when her scars burned so fiercely she thought she'd lose herself. And because she admitted those truths, others found themselves admitting their own. Carter's Roadhouse, once a simple roadside bar, began to take shape as something far greater, a sanctuary. Murphy, the bar's owner, returned from a trip to find his establishment transformed. The walls now bore unit patches pinned by patrons' photographs of squads grinning in desert sun medals hung with quiet reverence. A corner shelf had grown into a small library of military memoirs and history books left behind by visitors who felt the place was worthy of their stories. On Tuesday nights, veterans filled every booth and stool, swapping tales and laughter that carried more healing than silence ever could. But the change was not only for the veterans. Locals, who had sat quietly on the sidelines that fateful night, began returning too. They brought their curiosity, their gratitude, and their willingness to understand. They asked questions, sometimes clumsy, often earnest. And in the answers, they learned that veterans weren't broken relics of war, but people resilient, scarred, funny, flawed, alive. Naomi became the bridge, her presence anchoring the conversations. Her bar was no longer just a watering hole. It was a classroom, a chapel, a community. The more Naomi leaned into this role, the more she felt something in herself shift. For years, she had carried her service like a shadow, a thing that followed her, but that she never turned to face. Now, she began to see it differently. Her discipline, her scars, her dog tags. These weren't burdens. They were the foundations of her new mission. She didn't need to carry a rifle anymore to serve. She could serve by creating space, by making sure a young soldier, just home from deployment, had a place to sit without judgment, by letting a retired sergeant finally cry over a beer without shame. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the attention suffocated her, when the stories reopened wounds she thought had long since scarred over. There were mornings when she looked at herself in the mirror and wondered if she was fooling herself, if she was really building peace or just masking pain with routine. But each time, something grounded her. Sometimes it was a quiet thank you from a patron who hadn't spoken of their service in decades. Sometimes it was a new face, a young Marine or soldier, just back from overseas eyes, carrying the 1,000-yard stare Naomi knew too well, softening under the weight of belonging. And sometimes it was as simple as the clink of a coffee cup, the sound of ordinary life continuing, reminding her that survival itself was a kind of victory. The turning point came 3 weeks later, when a woman walked into the bar just before closing. She was young, maybe 22, her hair pulled tight beneath a faded ball cap. She introduced herself hesitantly. Private First Class Danielle Green, just home from her first deployment. Her hands trembled as she clutched her water glass, and her voice cracked as she confessed she didn't know how to live in the world she'd come back to. Naomi sat across from her, the room empty, except for Jake sweeping near the jukebox, and listened. "You don't go back," Naomi told her gently. "You don't become who you were before. That person is gone. What you do is build someone new out of what's left. You carry the discipline, the loyalty, the grit, and you find a new way to use it. For me, it's here. For you, it might be somewhere else. But the truth is, you're not alone in it. Not anymore." Danielle cried, and Naomi led her offering not platitudes, but presence. And when the young soldier left that night, she carried herself a little taller. Moments like that convinced Naomi she had stumbled into her true post. Not a battlefield, not a covert mission, but a roadside bar where she could still protect, still serve, still lead. The uniform was gone, the rifle retired, but the mission remained. She had traded deserts for sawdust floors, patrols for pouring coffee, but the essence of who she was had never left. And maybe it never should. By the end of that month, Carter's Roadhouse was known across counties not as a place where bikers once caused trouble, but as the place where strength wore an apron and healing poured from taps. Veterans came not because they were invited, but because they felt called. Civilians came because they wanted to witness a place where dignity and respect weren't negotiable. They were the law of the room. And Naomi Carter, once invisible, stood at the center of it all. She hadn't sought transformation, but it had come to her anyway. And in its arrival, she realized something vital. Peace was not a state of hiding. It was an act of creation, built table by table, story by story, night after night. And she was just getting started. In the months that followed, Carter's Roadhouse became more than a bar, more than a sanctuary. It became a story in its own right, one that traveled far beyond the neon glow of its sign off the highway. Newspapers picked it up first, small local columns about a black woman veteran standing down a biker gang, about a place that had become a beacon for those carrying invisible wounds. Then came the larger outlets, the ones that painted Naomi Carter as both a hero and a mystery, a woman who turned a roadside bar into holy ground. Naomi never courted that attention, but she also didn't run from it. She knew now that hiding was no longer her mission. The real legacy wasn't in the headlines. It was in the ripple effect she witnessed night after night. Veterans began bringing their families, introducing children to a space where service wasn't glorified, but understood. Civilians who had once kept their distance leaned in to listen, learning what sacrifice looked like, not through polished speeches, but through the quiet confessions shared over beer and coffee. Young service members came seeking guidance, and Naomi gave it freely, not as a lecture, but as a hand steadying theirs, reminding them they were not alone in the dark. One evening, a man approached her with a small box. Inside lay a purple heart she had left behind years earlier in the chaos of recovery. He was a Navy corpsman who had tended to her after an ambush in Afghanistan. "I thought you might want this back," he said. Naomi studied it for a long moment, then walked it to the wall, where Patch's medals and photos now lived in collective memory. She placed it there not as a personal trophy, but as part of the larger mosaic. This was not about her, it was about all of them. Carter's Roadhouse began drawing visitors from across state lines. Some came to see the woman they'd heard about, but most came to feel the air of the place, to sit in a room where dignity was enforced not by law, but by the sheer gravity of Naomi's presence. And as more people came, Naomi realized something profound. She had stopped running from her past, not just for herself, but for all those who needed proof that survival could become purpose. Her story became a seed planted in others. A retired sergeant opened a coffee shop across town with free counseling nights for veterans. A young woman who had sat trembling at Naomi's table enlisted in the army, not out of naivete, but with clear eyes and the knowledge that service was not just a burden, but also a bond. Local schools invited Naomi to speak not about war, but about resilience, about what it meant to build peace after surviving chaos. Standing behind the bar, one late night, Naomi caught her reflection in the mirror again. The woman staring back was no longer invisible. She wasn't just the Marine who had fought in forgotten battles, nor just the server who wiped tables with perfect precision. She was both fully, without apology, and in that acceptance, she had found something greater than peace. She had found legacy. Naomi Carter would never fade back into anonymity, but she no longer wanted to. The Roadhouse was her post, and the people who walked through its doors were her mission. Still serving, still protecting, still faithful, always. In the end, Naomi Carter's story is not just about one woman standing up to a gang of outlaws in a dusty roadside bar. It is about resilience, the hidden strength that lies beneath ordinary appearances, and the unshakable truth that real power often reveals itself in the quietest forms. Naomi reminded us that the measure of a person's worth is not in how loudly they demand respect, but in how faithfully they live their values even when no one is watching. Her journey shows us that peace is not found by running from our scars, but by transforming them into sources of strength. She carried wounds, both seen and unseen, but chose not to let them define her. Instead, she turned them into lessons, into tools for building community, into bridges between people who thought they had nothing in common. Naomi's courage teaches us that true warriors are not those who fight for domination, but those who fight to protect dignity, compassion, and humanity. This story is also a call to look again at the people around us. How often do we misjudge others, assuming weakness, where strength is hidden, assuming ordinariness, where greatness is quietly at work? Naomi was dismissed as a simple server, overlooked by those who thought they held all the power. Yet when the moment came, she revealed that strength does not need to shout, it only needs to stand firm. For every reader, the message is clear. Each of us carries battles the world may never see, but each of us also has the potential to turn survival into service wounds, into wisdom, fear, into courage. You don't need to be a Marine or a sheriff or a fighter in a bar to live this truth. You only need the willingness to stand for what is right, to protect what matters, and to live with integrity, even when it costs you comfort. Naomi Carter's legacy is a reminder that strength is not a mask to be hidden, nor a weapon to be flaunted. It is a light meant to guide others out of darkness. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own hidden strength, or inspired you to see others differently, then join us in keeping these stories alive. Subscribe to the channel today and be part of a community that believes in courage, resilience, and hope. Your support is what fuels us to share more stories like this, stories that can change